Hello to all the guests today to a new episode of New Ways of Being. And I have just a fantastic guest here with me today. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Uh, that is Robert Atkinson, who is here with me. Uh, he has done so many things. He's a prolific author. Um, I'm going to give the short version of his bio. Robert Atkinson, PhD, author, speaker, and developmental psychologist, is a 2017 Nautilus Book Award winner for The Story of Our Time, From Duality to Interconnectedness to Oneness. And he's a co-editor of Our Moment of Choice, Evolutionary Visions and Hope for the Future. And I think if I'm counting right, Bob, your new book must put you at 10.
12, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay. 12 books. Uh, Here in this episode today, we are going to talk about two of the books that stand out in relationship to a project that Bob and I are working on together, which is a book that's called We Can Change the World. And the subtitle will say something about it is a collaborative effort of people who have delved into consciousness and have a lot of wisdom to share on that subject. So these two books fall into that category. I'm looking forward uh, to this conversation. And the one other thing that I did want to mention about Bob is that he is a professor emeritus of cross-cultural human development and religious studies at the University of Southern Maine and director of Story Commons. So as I understand it, he was a professor there for many years, and uh, has this incredible background that's led him to research and write all of these books that he has written. So thank you so much for joining us today. Um, Say a few words, Bob. What are you up to now?
Thanks, Ray. It's great to be with you. What I'm up to now? Well, it's been about a month since my last book came out, and so I'm pretty involved in getting that off the ground. That's called the Way of Unity: Principles and Preconditions for Peace. So that is my 12th book, and it's kind of a bridging some of the other books, and also at the same time taking them a step further to really the logical conclusion or destination for where the earlier books were pointing. Um, as you mentioned, my 2017 book was The Story of Our Time, and that presented a lot of principles and background, but it didn't really identify what the outcome of all that would be. And that's what I do with the Way of Unity. I try to make it clear how, when we understand and apply and integrate what I call unitive principles into our daily lives, as well as into the infrastructure of society at all levels, from regional to national to global, the natural outcome of that long-term process will be first world unity, then world peace. And so this latest book really focuses on that outcome of world peace. And I'm very much involved right now with the getting that book out there. and explaining how it is an involved and collective process that every single one of us, all 8 billion of us, are part of and necessary for.
That that's fantastic. And yeah, so the book's been out for about a month now. Um, I read The Story of Our Time. It's just an amazing book, and you take such a big and broad perspective into the evolution of humanity in that book. So I've read that book. I've not read your new book, The Way of Unity, but I think I understand your perspective on that. And the story of our time, you talk a lot about um, uh, oneness and how that's such an important part, and that our consciousness is a key factor in what we are experiencing in humanity, in the world. So I think in this new book, you take that just a step further and um, dig more into how you how oneness can unfold. Would that be one way of looking at it?
Yeah, definitely. And so the book, the new book, is um, presented in kind of three parts or three perspectives. The first part is about how we can understand the nature of the universe as being an expression of unity itself or wholeness. And that's really the first step in this long process, is understanding the nature of the universe. The universe was born in oneness, in unity, in wholeness, which means also that the universe was born in peace.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've heard one of the most common uh, phrases from most sacred scriptures is in the beginning, and then we all know what can come after that. But the part that we don't recognize or include with that, with what in the beginning really signifies and means, is that in the beginning there was peace, and we when when humanity came along in the evolution of species, there was a time when the original indigenous peoples observed nature and natural laws all around them,
Mm-hmm.
and they were able to recognize from that the universe is an expression of wholeness and of unity. And so they incorporated that understanding into their stories that held the communities together. But then, as evolution continued, uh, humanity grew and grew, and communities expanded and spread out and became more diverse. And that is when we uh, saw the introduction of the opposite kinds of stories. Previously, and in the beginning, we had what I also call unitive narratives. But as humanity expanded and spread out and got more diverse and conflicts came up and everything, then that introduced what we could call divisive narratives, which is about narratives that separated us as a human family. So the interesting thing, though, is that now, a few millennia later, we've reached a time where we recognize now that we need to bring back an awareness of unitive narratives and or narratives that bring about unity. Because if we don't, if things continue being sort of controlled by divisive narratives, as we see very clearly going on in the world today, that could lead us down a path that is really difficult, if not impossible, to return from the further we go down that path. So it's become really evident that we're at a time of urgency in bringing about and applying unitive narratives, sharing our own unitive narratives with each other. So that's the part of the new process that we're in now. And as I also think of this time that we're entering as the beginning of the unitive age, where we're entering an age where we will be living by principles that bring us together, principles that bring about unity. There's a lot of work to be done in the world for that to be realized, obviously. But and that's what I so going back to the new book. The first part is the recognition that that's how the universe began as a wholeness, and then the second part of that book is about recognizing that there is an individual and a collective process that we're going through that I started to get to it a minute ago. But the third part of the book focuses on how that is already happening in the world now. So the third part of the book is about the thousands of communities around the world that are already applying unitive principles and how, in their daily lives, in their own local small communities. And what they're doing in that process is building a culture of peace in their own communities. And so that's the very, very early steps of when we'll recognize that those communities that are being built now around unitive principles, they're the beginning stepping stones that will take us to wider and wider, broader and broader, more and more communities worldwide that are carrying out their daily lives according to unitive principles. So again, it's a long-term process, but there is, and it's also like one of the other metaphors that I use in this new book is that humanity hasn't recognized it yet, but we are an equivalent of what is known in some fields, scientific fields, as mycelial networks. Humanity is its own mycelial network, where there's a lot that goes on underground or out of sight, while other things are happening above the ground that would feel and seem almost antithetical to what's going on underneath the surface. That is what is going on right now with humanity too.
Sure.
So that's an interesting phenomenon to think of the human family as a mycelial network that is carrying out an organic renewal process to rebuild, reconstruct the world around us,
Right.
as happens naturally and periodically and cyclically in nature as well.
Let me ask here. So the communities you mentioned, and I'm not sure that I'm very aware of these communities and what you're talking about. Can you give an example? Are they all small communities, or are they? How? Yeah, tell us more about that.
Yeah. In the so most of the book, The Way of Unity, is built upon the teachings and the principles of the Baha'i faith. And that's where the holistic perspective comes from that I mentioned when we look at universe, the entire universe from a holistic perspective. And there are also what are in the middle section of the book are a series of 9 unitive principles, and there's a number of ways they can be expressed, but they are um, unitive principles that take in concepts like the equality of women and men, which would be unitive relationships. There's another one that takes in the elimination of the extremes of wealth and poverty. That would be the principle of unitive economics. And those all also come from the Baha'i teachings. So, which are now about a century and 3/4 uh, old, have been around since that time, since the mid 19th century, which is also interesting to relate that timing to when something else became noticeable in the world. It was right around that time, mid to late 19th century, when we can first identify a number of advancements in the human rights field, like the elimination of slavery, the beginning of the civil rights movement, and before that, the women's rights movement. And so that all of those began from the mid 1900s on through to the mid 20th century, and still today too. And one of the ways of understanding that is that periodically and cyclically throughout the history of humanity, there have been releases of spiritual energies that have advanced civilization as well. And so that was one that happened around the mid 1900s, and we're still seeing and trying to bring about the kind of society that can result from the application of and living by all of those unitive principles and more that I mentioned a minute ago. So during that process, there have been, I think one of the latest numbers now, there are Baha'i communities in over 100,000 localities around the world. And when we look at the makeup of the Baha'i world community, it is probably the most diverse community on the planet now because of its cultural, ethnic makeup. And what's been happening over that century and 3/4, mostly in the last century, is that those communities in every continent have been applying what I refer to as unitive principles in their daily lives, in their communities, and in many communities in traditional cultures like in Africa and Asia, South America. Many of those processes that started within the Baha'i community itself have expanded to include the entire community that for each of those locations. And there have been, and that's one of the things that I do in the third part of that book is I go into a short sort of summary and highlight a dozen or 2 dozen of those communities around the world that have been doing that, and give some examples of the ways in which those communities have changed. Just one quick example: a very traditional community in Africa that had been run as a patriarchy when it became known that not only the women, but other men in those communities wanted there to be more equality between women and men. There were some of those patriarchal leaders who heard that and understood it, and then decided it was time to help that process along. And they really supported a series of um, women's conferences and other gatherings and initiatives like that that were designed to bring about the equality of women and men in their own communities. So there are many examples like that that I refer to in the book, and that's ongoing today and expanding.
Let me comment here. When I read The Story of Our Time, and you mentioned in there uh, principles of the Baha'i faith, I I had never investigated the Baha'i faith, so I really knew nothing about it. And I found the teachings or the principles that you mentioned to be very interesting because they did seem to be uh, based in a higher consciousness or desire to have a more conscious approach to what they teach. And so I found that quite interesting, and I can relate to what you're saying that those communities probably are very taking more unitive approach to living.
Yeah, and it is an evolutionary process, and there have been many uh, advances, as I sort of referred to earlier, throughout humanity's evolution. But we were living, all that kind of took place in a very different setting and very different circumstances than, than we have now. And I mean, you can go through all of the major um, faith communities. Actually, one way to look at it, which I do in the story of our time, is that it is a cyclical evolutionary process that we're in the midst of. And that cyclical process is now we're in the phase where we're attempting to return to an understanding that was there in the beginning. So going back again to the beginning of time, we could say that the indigenous cultures, the very earliest indigenous cultures, had their own core stories that address the mysteries of existence, and they also had stories um, that pointed to stories that were prophecies, okay, that were prophetic, in the same way that all faith communities from the earliest times on have prophetic stories as well. And all of those, whether they're indigenous or faith communities that we can identify over time, all of those point to a distant time in the future that's often seen as the promised day of universal harmony, when when the teachings of all those traditions will be fulfilled. And so that's been happening at a stage by stage process. And as I mentioned earlier, starting with around the mid 19th century, that's when we began to realize and begin to also at the same time look at the world as a whole. It took a half a century or more um, after that to really understand it in a practical sense. Not until after World War I, World War II. Then by then, by the end of World War II, we really, knew that we were living in one world that needed to become more united, as expressed in the need of that moment for the United Nations. So it's been that process, and the teachings of Baha'u'llah were um, pioneering uh, teachings that were a little bit before their time, but became very clear by the end of World War II that they were not really before their time, but were came when they did to prepare the world and provide a kind of a long runway for the takeoff of the plane that's going to take us to that promised day uh, that all of the sacred traditions had in mind, and so we have when we think about what it really would take to bring the world and the human family together as one, we have to consider those unitive principles that I just mentioned a couple earlier,
Yes.
um, that are essential for that to happen. And so we're becoming more and more aware of those now as we go into as we're halfway through the second decade of the second millennium already. There's no way to not understand that those unitive principles are necessary. And so that's where we're at now is coming back around to full circle to that realization. And at the same time, as we know so well too, there are so many people that are seeing what's going on as the end of the world, or
Mm.
could if things don't get better, it could be the end of the world, that kind of thing. And one thing that I found interesting was while I actually mentioned this in my 2017 book, The Story of Our Time, a few years before that, actually in December 2012, which was hyped as the end of the Mayan calendar, and nobody really knew what that meant. We're coming to an end of a very long calendar. Does that mean the end of the world? So I was in Guatemala in December 2012, and there's still 40% of the population in Guatemala are Mayans, and so I was able to ask one of them what the end of the long count calendar meant, and I got a very clear, direct, matter of fact answer. They said the end of one cycle is followed by the beginning of another,
Mhm.
and that confirms a timeless law of nature that progress is always a process of birth, death, and rebirth. What happens though is we tend to forget the renewal part or the rebirth part.
Mm.
And so this is where we are now. We're at the beginning of a new phase of renewal in the world, and both of those books, my 2017 book and this one that came out this year, a month ago, um, are really focusing on what that renewal is all about, why and how, and what the outcome of that will be. And of course, if we just apply a little bit of common sense and a holistic perspective, the natural outcome of the organic renewal that's in process now will be the long promised peace on earth.
Right. You know, in my podcast, for several years, I think I've been talking about uh, that it seems to me we need a shift in consciousness. And I talk about shifting from the consciousness of separation and fear that comes out of separation to the consciousness of unity and love, because love is something that goes with unity. It is a process and a force or power, if you will, that brings unity into being and creation as well. You, in your book, The Story of Our Time, you talk in different terms, but I think say the same thing, uh, that we need to shift from the consciousness of duality to the consciousness of oneness. So coming from that, I think my perspective is that people aren't thinking in terms of consciousness, and so they don't see it quite that way. But I think it's when you talk about unity of principles, I think it's important if they help bring that consciousness. And I think that's exactly what they would do, right? Change the consciousness.
Yes, definitely. I mean, and you mentioned earlier, consciousness really is the key, the primary key to understanding how our world is going to change, how it's going to be renewed. It'll be through the evolution of our consciousness and becoming elevated from a dualistic consciousness to a holistic consciousness. So um, that is clearly one thing that we need to remember, is that consciousness is the key to the process, and it's also the center of the process that I referred to earlier. Where we can think of there's many versions of this of the three-part process that we can break this down into. I'll just use the simplest form, which is the story model. So we're all familiar with the three-part story model of beginning, middle, and end. But that's only the surface level. If we look at story a little bit deeper to really understand what traditional stories are about, what they're for, and what they do, we can recognize that three-part process as beginning, muddle, and resolution.
I like that.
And that's that way of looking at that pattern is true both on a personal level and a collective level. There's no difference really when it comes to that pattern being carried out. There's no difference at all in it, whether it's carried out on an individual basis or a collective basis. And um, one of the problems we have with that is that, especially when we think of stories in the traditional sense, there's a confusion about what the term myth really means. And when that was used by the indigenous peoples way back, and in every culture, it wasn't in the common sense way of a myth being a falsehood. It was actually the opposite. They used myth as representing the most important truth of all things. And so, and this is also clarified by Jung, the psychologist, who said, "Our myth has become mute and gives no answers." What by that he means that we've lost sight of the truth of what what um, what what really inspires us and what directs us and what carries us forward. We've lost sense of that, and that's what we need to hear from again. So a myth in its truest sense is a guiding story that needs to be alive and growing, that needs to provide inspiration and direction. And this is the other thing about what a myth or a true guiding story does, is that it provides us the direction we need to know what the process of transformation is and how it's happening to us and where it's leading us. We um, we've in the confusion and the chaos of today, with such an emphasis on disinformation being everywhere and almost being impossible to distinguish from truth from falsehood. Our current prevailing story seems to lack a resolution to the muddle facing the world today. But when we go back to understand the very nature of transformation itself, there is a built-in pattern to transformation, and this is why it becomes so important to understand what that pattern of transformation is, and what it's made up of. Again, on the most simple level, the pattern of transformation consists of beginning, muddle, and resolution. What that means really, though, is that opposition is the catalyst for transformation. So there can't be true and deep and lasting transformation without opposition of some kind.
Mm.
That opposition that we're facing collectively today is there for a very important reason. It's to help bring about the collective organic renewal that will lead us to the resolution that will take us closer to that promised time that was mentioned before. So opposition and tension, all of that is a necessary part of the process of transformation.
And could it be viewed as a learning process? We see what's not working and we learn from it, or is it more complex than that?
That's about as that's a good way to make it as simple as it can get. Is that it's there, and it needs to be seen as a learning process. We need to learn from the opposition that we're facing. We need to recognize that it's there for a reason, for a purpose. And so there's very clearly a lesson to be learned from from the difficulty that is experienced in whether it's our personal lives or collectively. And that's as I was sort of referring to a minute ago, and that's because transformation depends upon and incorporates adversity, which is incorporated into many prescribed transitions, like traditional rites of passage. That, if you understand, for anyone who knows about rites of passage, you know that incorporates in itself adversity to be overcome, because that creates the opposition necessary for deep change. And that's really the goal of transformation. Again, whether it's on the personal level or the collective level, the goal of the transformation process is not the uncertainty or the chaos that initially rises from the adversity, but the synthesis and the union of seemingly separate parts when they are recognized as the whole that they are.
And would it be fair to say, uh, yes, we can describe this in terms of transformation, but uh, the bigger picture that you lay out is of evolution. And so you're saying that it's a natural part of evolution and it's cyclical. Is that right?
That's it. That's exactly what I'm saying. And if we could take on that holistic perspective, we would have a lot less. We would make the muddle that we're in a lot less difficult for ourselves if we were able to recognize the big picture that it's all part of. So it's definitely um, necessary for our progress to recognize that as a learning process and something that is necessary for us to make that change, because it is what is going to lead us to that promised time that all that indigenous cultures and all the uh, sacred communities have talked about forever. Um, but at the same time, though, it is a twofold process that's happening. Two things are happening at the same time. There's a purging and a reshaping of humanity going on, while at the same time there's the renewal and the movement toward wholeness of the human family that is going on at the same time, which will be necessary for us to realize our unity as a human family.
Let me ask here. I read your high level. Uh, I guess you wrote it probably. I don't think it was a review by someone else, but the high level presentation of your new book, The Way of Unity, and it mentioned that you talk in the book about strategies for humanity to ultimately achieve peace and unity. Could you talk about those strategies just a little bit?
Yeah, so that's what I was referring to earlier too, about the unitive principles that we have now that are meant to be used as tools and resources to renew communities, and that are being put in place and applied in those communities that I also referred to around the world. The there's a The book does go into a quite a detailed description of those 9 principles. Um, they are they really begin with the recognition that um, what all of this change and renewal is leading us toward is the evolution of consciousness to what I refer in the book as a unitive consciousness, and that's a consciousness that brings about unity by understanding that all things in the entire universe are ultimately one. It's a grand, uh, the universe itself is a grand unity and diversity and wholeness and motion. So, looking at our progress toward unitive consciousness, I mean, um, that's an interesting concept to look at um, from an evolutionary perspective as well. Back around 1900, that was referred to as cosmic consciousness by a Canadian psychiatrist, Maurice Buck, who wrote a book on cosmic consciousness. One of the things that he pointed out in that book was that he actually identified maybe 100 or so examples that he knew of up to about 1900 that were examples of cosmic consciousness. A century and a quarter later, we could probably identify, I would, I don't think I'd be off by saying we could identify millions of people who have that consciousness that brings about unity now. So this is what he understood in 1900 as well, was that if we can identify, say 100 in 1900 and a million or however many, 1,000 years, 100 years later, how many more will there be another century from now or 2 centuries from now? So what that means is that there will be a time, looking at the whole big picture from an evolutionary perspective, there will be a time when unitive consciousness is the norm for all 8 billion or however many there are whenever that comes about. That'll be the norm in a time in the future. There are others that go along with that and that support and that are really the more specific expression of a unit of consciousness would be uh, unitive justice, which is justice that brings about unity by maintaining community solidarity on all levels and eliminating all forms of prejudice. Another one might be unitive education, or education that brings about unity by approaching all knowledge as a reflection of a greater wholeness. And that also bridges the gaps in our knowledge of reality and identifies the underlying harmony of all ways of knowing. As with, we already are getting a sense now of between science and spirituality. And I mentioned quickly earlier unitive relationships, or relationships on all levels and between all beings that bring about unity by recognizing gender equality, as well as the innate potential of children and youth and the sacredness of all life. So those are a few of the 9 unitive principles that are mentioned in the new book, and that have been put into practice by the thousands of communities that I give a few examples of in chapter 6 of that book. Because the point being that when those unitive principles are put into practice in our everyday lives, in our neighborhoods and communities and cities and nations, that's a that's a process that really is should be understood as globally scalable and easily connectable between one circle of one strong, vibrant community is easily connected to another strong, vibrant community, especially when they're both being sustained by the same set of unitive principles. That's just inherently globally scalable.
And do you think that it needs to, these principles need to be promoted and shared in kind of a community type of perspective as opposed to purely individual?
Well, really,
we need the interconnectedness, in other words.
Right. It definitely is a both and rather than one or the other. It's a process that has to be happening on all of those levels at the same time, And I mentioned another concept in the book related to that, which is that it's not about an uh, uh, above down movement or an down up movement either. It's about both together. Um, because what'll happen when those processes are in motion on both uh, the highest collective level and the smallest collective level, both at the same time, then that process of renewing communities and society, it will become a process that meets in the middle of above and below. And that's the only way that deep, lasting change and transformation can happen is when it's happening both ways at the same time, from above and from below together.
So, do we need a lot of people become aware of these ideas, these principles, and sharing them at different levels? I mean, certainly we don't have like a group in United States government that would all agree that, oh, this is the way we should do it, and that these principles are where we start. So I think you're talking about where it's a process of sharing information and ideas as well as just, I mean, as part of evolution, I would guess.
Yeah, it definitely is an evolutionary process that is happening organically, whether we recognize that or would agree with that or not. It is a process that is happening currently, and the only way it's going to be completed to its destined culmination is if we allow it to be dynamic and organic. So that is happening, as my book tries to point out in chapter 6, with these thousands of communities that are doing it on that level now. The biggest problem we have is that that same process has been proposed to the highest levels of the United Nations, but they're not ready for it yet on that level, even in the United Nations. So there's required a major shift in the way that we carry out our governing processes on all levels, from community to city to national to global. And one of the other unitive principles that I talk about in the book is unitive global governance. That would be a multi-level global governance system interconnecting all strata of society by the same set of organizing unitive principles that creates, sustains, and deepens world unity. That's what needs to happen in the most vital, critical way as soon as possible. And there are a lot of people at that global level who recognize the need for major changes, either within the United Nations itself or something that is an evolution beyond the United Nations. So, so it's got to, in order to reach the promised day of peace on earth, both of those need to be happening simultaneously. And one of the biggest questions we have in that process right now is how or what is it going to take for these unitive principles to be understood, recognized, and adopted on the global level, whether it's through the United Nations or some evolved version of that.
Yeah, that's a big question. When I read The Story of Our Time, um, you talk about building a culture of oneness, and and my immediate reaction was, boy, I agree totally, but it seems so challenging in today's world, just full of conflict at many different levels. And in that book, you were also quite optimistic about our progress towards oneness, and you pointed to a lot of different um, organizational things that have been happening. Um, but my question today would be, and it's only been, I'd say, 8 years later, or maybe I have the publication date wrong, but are you as optimistic today as you were when you wrote that book?
The short answer is yes, I am. I still believe what I wrote uh, then, and that's why I felt there was a need for another book that made the not only the importance of those unitive principles more evident. um, I also felt it was necessary to make it as clear as possible what the natural outcome of that process will be. And so it kind of goes back to I think maybe what you're getting at is uh, it is what I've been writing about from the story of our time in 2017, 8 years ago, to today with the way of unity, is that we're involved in a long-term process that requires the application of certain principles the unitive principles that I referred to. And but because evolution occurs in a cyclical way, it's clearly not a straight line that we're talking about. And so we are in the midst of a cyclical process that is bringing us back around to the realization of something that we knew when we think of humanity as a collective. Humanity as a collective has its own developmental stages, just like the individual does. And in humanity's infancy, we then understood that the universe was all interconnected. Everything else in the universe was all interconnected. We knew that then. We went through the typical stages of childhood, adolescence, and we're just now beginning to come out of our collective adolescence, which involved, all the wars that the world has known, and we're coming out of that right after World War II. As I mentioned, we recognized the need for the United Nations to help end those. And so we're at the end point of our stage of adolescence, and we're just entering into maturity, our collective stage of maturity. And what that means as we're reaching that and moving towards that, there's two things happening. It's becoming more difficult for some to let go of what we might think of as our adolescent ways.
Mhm.
Some are just holding on to that as hard as they can, while many others are ready to move into our period of collective maturity. In order for us to do that as a collective, we need to understand certain principles. And The primary principle in my mind for that, and this brings it right back again to where we started, which is with consciousness. We need to recognize that the primary, what I also might think of as a meta principle, that's so critical today to understand that, keep that in mind as a source of inspiration and a source of hope for us, is that, and it's really as simple as this: consciousness evolves toward unity and wholeness.
Mhm.
Now, there's a lot built into that meta principle.
Mhm.
Consciousness evolves toward unity and wholeness. If that's the case, does that mean that there is something guiding us collectively towards that? Is there a purpose to existence, to this world we live in, to all the other planets? So that meta principle really gets to the heart of what we might also think of as our meta beliefs, because we couldn't really accept or adopt or live by the principle of consciousness evolves toward unity and wholeness unless we also believe that there is a purpose to creation,
Mhm.
which is what all of the indigenous cultures and all of the sacred traditions of the world have given us in their heritage, that there will be a time when we can also think of the words of John Lennon. There will be a time when the world will live as one. Um, that's all. So that meta principle of consciousness evolves towards unity is built upon that belief that is evident in all of the world's sacred traditions, including indigenous and the world's religions. It, with that understanding that consciousness evolves toward unity and wholeness, we can each individually and collectively have that assurance that that's where we're headed, that that's the outcome we're headed toward, that that's our destiny collectively. We individually may or may not be around to see it here, but that will happen.
Very good. Well, Robert, with that, um, and we've covered quite a lot of territory here. You've given us some great information, uh, not just about your books, but about these principles that you've learned from all of your studies. Um, and you've been in a very powerful position to really study cross-cultural human development and religious studies. Um, and very few of us really dig into those kinds of studies on our own. So you've really brought that out in your books, and I'm so pleased that you've been here today to share your insights and wisdoms with us. Um, are there any final words you would like to say to bring this to a conclusion?
Well, it's been great being with you, Ray. And I guess the only thing I would quickly mention is that in the new book, The Way of Unity, there is a study guide. That book is meant to be used by book clubs and groups
Uh,
to study together as a group, and especially to use the study guide that's in the book itself. So that is for group use, and I hope that people can get together in groups to go through that book and to look more to reflect more deeply on how people in small groups can come up with their own ways to carry out the unitive principles in their own neighborhood, their own community.
Okay. Share with the listeners your website.
Yeah, that my name, www.robertatkinson.net. And this is the book that I just referred to, The Way of Unity.
Very good. Thank you. And I'll mention one other thing real quickly. When I looked at your website, I noticed you have a uh, a oneness pledge. I thought that was kind of cool, just um, suggesting to people that they understand oneness well enough to pledge that they would like it in their own lives. So a great idea.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that is all for today. And to my listeners, have a great day and a great life.